it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. This is PSReady, the channel all about PlayStation. If you're looking for a better source on the internet for PlayStation news and updates, you're not going to find it. In today's video, I wanted to do something a little bit fun and different and rank the PlayStation consoles. It's going to be a little bit of a longer video, so buckle in. I think this is going to be a ton of fun. Just to lay out the ground rules here, I just wanted an excuse to talk about all the different PlayStation hardware that's come out over the years. So this is like not even close to a worst to best ranking. It's just like my least favorite console, I would guess, in the PlayStation ecosystem to my most favorite. And at the end of the day, I absolutely love them all. I've been a PlayStation gamer my whole life, so I have great memories with each and every one of these consoles. So don't take the ranking too seriously. So the video is going to go in ascending order, I think is the way it would be if I do my least favorite first and then end with my most favorite, but that's how I'm doing it. So we're going to start out with the PlayStation Vita. If you've watched the channel for any significant amount of time, it's going to be a little surprising maybe that I put the Vita at the bottom because I absolutely love the Vita. It kind of got me my start in this whole career I have talking about video games because I had a Vita website back in the day that actually did pretty well. I did Vita reviews, I talked about software updates, I talked about hardware releases and accessories, and it made me kind of realize that I could do this as a job. But there are some things we have to talk about as to why the Vita never really seemed to catch on. So it came out February 15th, 2012. I was a freshman in college. I had the 3DS at the time and I traded that in right away for the PlayStation Vita with Uncharted Golden Abyss at launch. I also picked up a $20 PlayStation gift card and played MotorStorm RC all the time. And as far as the hardware goes, that thing, when it came out, was way ahead of its time. You got an OLED screen at launch, which, you know, even the Nintendo Switch had to build up to that with multiple different hardware revisions before we got anything close to an OLED. The Steam Deck also had to do another hardware revision to get to the OLED, but no, the Vita did it in reverse. The first Vita had an OLED screen, and then the Vita 2000, Vita Slim, whatever you want to call it, they downgraded it to like an LCD screen, but I ended up picking that up as well. That's the one I still have, and the screen is nothing to laugh at on that either. Yes, the resolution is a little low, the screen's a little small, I think it's like 5 inches, but at the time it was like the coolest thing ever for me because I was a big handheld gamer and this was just so much farther ahead than anything I had ever seen before. It was also awesome that it had 2 joysticks instead of the analog nub that the PSP had. It had a really weird operating system that came along with a web browser, which was really cool at the time. You had full access to trophies, your PlayStation Network stuff, so you could add friends and message them on the go, which was sweet. And at launch, it even had a 3G model where you could get an AT&T plan. I couldn't swing the cash for that, and I'm kind of glad I didn't because as far as I know, you couldn't play games online with that 3G connectivity. It was mainly used for using the PlayStation Network, so it really felt a little half-baked and it wasn't worth the extra cost increase that brought it to, I'm pretty sure, over $300. But despite where the Vita ended up, and we'll talk about the negatives in a second, it had one of the strongest launch libraries of pretty much any PlayStation console ever released. But at launch, it had a huge lineup of games that were already available, like Little Deviants, Escape Plan, Hot Shots Golf World Invitational, Hustle Kings, Mod Nation Racers Road Trip, Super Stardust Delta, Uncharted Golden Abyss, Wipeout 2048, Army Corps from Hell, Asphalt Injection, Ben 10 Galactic Racing, Blaze Blue Continuum Shift, Dungeon Hunter Alliance, Dynasty Warriors Next, F1 2011, EA Sports, FIFA Soccer, Lumines Electronic Symphony, Michael Jackson The Experience, Plants vs. Zombies, Rayman Origins, Shinobi 2 Revenge of Zen, Tales of Space Mutant Blobs Attack, Touch My Katamari, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and Virtua Tennis 4 World Tour Edition. So as far as that launch lineup goes, there were a lot of games to play, and there were some really good standout titles like Wipeout 2048, Uncharted Golden Abyss, and what was the third game that I loved? Oh, Super Stardust Delta. That game was absolutely incredible, and it kind of set the stage for Resogun to be this hit launch title for the PlayStation 4 a little bit later on. So as someone who didn't have a lot of money, it was great, right? Like I could play a game like Uncharted and then I could keep that, and then when I saved up enough money, I could move on to Wipeout 2048, and by that time they had released Wipeout HD and Fury as DLC for 2048, so there was a ton of content there. Then I had indie games like Super Stardust Delta that I could play indefinitely and always try and reach my high score, and then just later that year we got Gravity Rush, which is one of Sony's most underappreciated games and one of my favorite Platinum trophies I've ever gotten in a game. So the launch lineup was great, but things really kind of took a nosedive almost immediately because there were so many problems that just like hamstrung the Vita at launch that were really unforced errors. The first big problem was that it didn't have backwards compatibility at launch, so you couldn't play PSP or PS1 games. They were promised at launch, so we knew it was coming. We did have to wait quite a long time to get it, but that functionality wasn't there. And of course, the biggest problem with the PlayStation Vita was the memory situation. You did not get enough onboard memory with the Vita to actually use it. Like if you wanted to play games, you could save a couple of them to the thing, but you really needed to pick up a memory card. And not only were the capacities of the proprietary memory cards low, the prices were completely insane. Like at the time, I'm pretty sure a 64 gigabyte card was something like over $100. So I had to slum it with like either a 16 or 32 gigabyte card, and with how many games were becoming digital only for that console because it was a handheld, I was constantly having to pick and choose what games I was actually going to keep installed on the Vita. The other big problem it had was a two-faceted one. It was both a lack of first-party support after launch because of low sales, and also just a lack of quality. We did get in the first year or two Black Ops Declassified and Resistance Burning Skies, whereas in the past on PSP, when you'd get games like Resistance Retribution, they were really good. They were like third-person shooters or just something a little bit different, but they existed in the universe they were pulled from. They felt like legitimate side stories that generally tied in to the bigger console counterparts. Resistance Burning Skies was like on par with a mobile game. The online absolutely sucked. The story was like 5 hours long, and the frame rate and graphics were terrible. Black Ops Declassified was also just a complete mess. It didn't even have a campaign as far as I know. Like it had some missions or something like that. The multiplayer was like classic Call of Duty multiplayer, but it just was super janky, and it didn't feel like it was worth shelling out a full $40 for that game. We eventually got Gravity Rush, which was really good. Soul Sacrifice was like a hard 7 out of 10 that became an 8 when they re-released it as Soul Sacrifice Delta. The biggest game I would say that they released was pretty late into the Vita's life cycle, and that was Killzone Mercenary. One of the only review copies I ever got from Sony. I love that game. I thought the story was cool. I am a diehard Killzone fan. Like I actually keep up with the lore and everything like that. Killzone Liberation on PSP was one of my most played games ever, but yeah, you know, there were just not that many games that Sony was putting out, and while there were quality experiences, they were so far and few between that they just didn't really ever help move sales of the PlayStation Vita. Other than Killzone Mercenary, I think the biggest game on the Vita overall was Persona 4 Golden. I know Persona was niche at the time, but it's exploded since then into something huge, and I just like to believe that that started because of a small group of people who played Persona 4 Golden on the Vita, then eventually wanted to play Persona 5. I also went back and played Persona 3 FES or Portable or whatever it was called, the PSP version on the Vita. So while yeah, I did have a lot of great gaming experiences on the Vita, it just never really landed in the right way that it needed to. I really think they were hitting that point where they were promising console quality graphics, and then it's like, why make games that are handheld only then? Like, why not just start making PS3 games that also run on the Vita? And to be fair, with stuff like PlayStation All-Stars, they eventually got there, but it was just not the right time for that handheld, and unfortunately it scared Sony away from continuing to make handhelds, which sucks. The next console on my list here is the PlayStation 1, the one that started it all and really just kicked everything off for Sony and started their world tour of gaming console dominance. It's weird again to put this one so low on the list, but it makes sense when you think about it from the standpoint that that's when they were really still trying to figure everything out. There were a lot of good games on it, and it was a solid console, but that era of gaming is kind of hard to revisit unless you're playing stuff like JRPGs or Resident Evil. You know, there are a huge library of games available, but a lot of it is really hard to go back to these days. So it's really just a victim of the time it came out, and theoretically you would want it so that every subsequent console is better, right? So that's why I have the PS1 ranked so low on this list. It hit the market in September of 2000 and it was $299, but they dropped the price super fast all the way down to like $150 and included games for it. And while I don't have the launch lineup, I got a list of notable games including Ridge Racer Type 4, Final Fantasy Tactics, Twisted Metal, Spyro the Dragon, Tomb Raider, Wipeout, Parappa the Rapper, Silent Hill, Gran Turismo and Gran Turismo 2, Crash 2 and Warped, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, Symphony of the Night, and Metal Gear Solid. Out of all those games, I think the ones that connected to me the most were Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil 1. All of my history with Metal Gear Solid is with PlayStation, and that was the game that you had to get a PlayStation to play because it was like cinematic, it was something anything new. It was just that good, where it really made people want to go out and get a PlayStation. And then we got the game Final Fantasy VII, which I gotta be honest, I'm playing for the first time right now. I'm about halfway through. I feel like an idiot for waiting so long because it's so good, but that game totally exploded the genre for JRPGs and showed people that this new 3D way of thinking when you're developing these types of games can really be the future. And it solidified things going forward for the Final Fantasy franchise, for better or worse. So with the 1-2 punch of Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII is completely unbeatable in that era of gaming, if you ask me. Just despite that, for all those games that I listed, there were hundreds more that were just mid or okay and just really didn't know how to take advantage of the dual stick support, because you got to remember the PS1 didn't launch with analog sticks. It launched with a version of the controller that didn't have them, and the DualShock came out much later. I'm pretty sure Ape Escape was the first game to take advantage of them, but it was the time when they were figuring everything out. It showed that they had potential to grow, and I feel like that's a pretty solid reason to keep it so low on my list. I will say, out of all of Sony's consoles, my favorite looking one is the PS1 Slim. The PSONE is how they called it, because it had that awesome flip up screen that would go over the disk drive, and it made it truly portable. Like, you could take that thing on a road trip if you had one of those AC adapters for your car, and I totally did that as a kid when my parents would drive us down to Florida. So I have great memories with the console. It's obviously iconic visually and just like vibe wise speaking. It's the one that started it all. But yeah, I'm ranking that one the second bottom of the list. Third up is another one of my favorite consoles, but there's a lot of reasons why it's ranked so low, and that is the PlayStation 3. We all know, looking back, that the PS3 has a great legacy when it comes to starting out some of Sony's greatest franchises like Uncharted, The Last of Us, Resistance, Infamous. The list goes on and on there. But if you look at the release window of PS3 games, the vast majority of the best games for the PS3 came out either in the mid to late era of its existence. The launch of the PlayStation 3 was absolutely rough. You could get two versions of it at launch, either $500 or $600. And the reason it was so expensive is because Sony just packed in way too many features that no one realistically would want to take advantage of, like having memory card ports, being able to install Linux on it, just weird extra stuff that didn't need to be there. They were obviously hoping that using Blu-rays would take off, and they did win that battle. Blu-ray won out against the Xbox 360, which sided with HD DVDs. But yeah, $600 at that time in 2006 was absolutely insane. But the one feature they ended up taking out before the price cut that really sucked was the fact that it had a full-on PS2 in it. Like, it had the actual PS2 hardware in it at launch, so you could put PS2 and PS1 games inside the PS3 and they would work absolutely fine. So if you're ever looking for a PS3, look for the one that has the flip up sort of like tab on the front of the console next to the eject and power buttons, because that's the one that can play PS1 and PS2 games, and they're extremely valuable. And unfortunately, its revolutionary way of running games, the cell architecture that they always talked about leading up to the PS3's release, while it was more powerful by a wide margin than what the Xbox 360 was using on paper, it was extremely difficult for developers to figure out how to use it. So even though the PS3 came out at least a year after the Xbox 360, when games launched on it at the very beginning, if it was a third-party game that was on both consoles, it would arguably run worse and look worse on the PlayStation 3. And the first-party titles we got were nothing crazy. Like, the original Resistance was definitely a standout, but other games like Heavenly Sword and Lair at the time that took advantage of the whole 6-axis thing that the controller did, they didn't really hit in the way that other games had in the past for Sony. So it was a really dire time for the PlayStation 3 when it launched. Eventually, they did drop the price. They released the PS3 Slim. They increased the hard drive size, and things got really good with games like the ones I mentioned at the beginning of this segment: Uncharted, The Last of Us, Infamous 2, Resistance 2, all these great games, even Resistance 3, Killzone 2 and 3. There were some incredible games, but the road to get there was really rough, and it was plagued in the middle of the generation by this month-long server outage where you could not log into the PlayStation Network. I was in high school. It was when all my friends had PlayStation 3s. We had all traded up from the Xbox 360. We were absolutely loving life all summer long, and right at the launch of SOCOM 4, the PlayStation Network goes down for 1/3 of our summer, and that just absolutely sucked because it was such a good time to be gaming when I didn't have a job or anything to really care about, and I couldn't play any online games. It was so frustrating, but I guess that's the big caveat for the PlayStation Network being free at the time, right? When they did bring back the PlayStation Network, they did give you a choice of 2 PS3 games and 2 PSP games, and the list was not bad at all. I picked Infamous and Dead Nation. I had never played Infamous other than playing it at a GameStop kiosk, and I love that game. Dead Nation is one of the best twin stick zombie games ever made, so that was a good pick there. The PSP games I got were Little Big Planet PSP and Killzone Liberation. I had Liberation on UMD, but my brother stole it and the casing cracked, so that was actually cool to get the game for free. And it was one of the first and only PSP games I ever engaged with DLC with, so overall, it was a good list of games. But it didn't make up for the fact that Sony took away like half my summer from playing games online like Resistance 2. So yeah, I can't forgive them for that. As much as I love the PS3 and it really kicked off my true fandom of PlayStation, because before I had the consoles, but I'd always gotten them late. This was the one that I got pretty close to launch. There were just so many problems with it that it just felt like, you know, we were again chasing our tail trying to make something great. And while they did eventually get there and it set them up for one of the best consoles on this list, I'm not going to tell you where I ranked it. The whole period of the PlayStation 3 era was a little bit up and down, and because of that, it's ranked pretty low on the list. All right, we have reached the center of the list with the PlayStation Portable, the PSP. I'll never forget it. I had just gotten a Nintendo DS for my birthday. My dad and I were flying to Florida, and he shows me this newspaper article with this beautiful Sony console right in the center of it, and it says, "This is the Nintendo killer." And man, I felt buyer's remorse for something I didn't even know existed at the time, and it just could not make me love the Nintendo DS. I was like, man, I think I should have just waited for this console I didn't know about. And eventually, later that year, around December, my grandpa took me to GameStop at the mall at Somerset Mall here out in Troy, Michigan. He got me a PSP with Tony Hawk's Underground 2 and a memory card. And man, that was like one of the best days of my life. And it was so much fun playing it in the car on the way back, talking to my grandpa about it, showing it off and being like, this is so cool. Thank you so much. And the funny thing is, if I had just waited a little bit longer, I could have gotten it for my birthday because it came out March 24th and my birthday is March 3rd. It was $249. Of course, just like with the Vita, they had proprietary memory with Memory Stick Duo. At least with that, you could use it with Sony cameras and other things, and it was like not just a memory card for the PlayStation Portable, but still, it was weird that they weren't using SD cards at that time because it felt like everything else was, like those budget MP3 players your mom would get you at Walgreens. And this was the era where handheld gaming was still a separate thing. Things hadn't quite merged yet, so it was a big spin-off era where Sony would have these huge franchises like God of War, Ratchet and Clank, Metal Gear Solid, you know, X, Y, and Z on the PlayStation 2, and then they would make a side game that would come out on the PSP. And that even applied to third-party games like Battlefront 2. You got a different version of Battlefront 2 on the PSP, but being able to take these full-fledged console games on the go was so awesome to me at the time. And of course, the battery life was terrible, but they countered that by making the battery completely removable, so I had extra batteries that I always kept charged up for our road trips down to Florida. But man, the list goes on and on of great PSP games. You got Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, Killzone Liberation, Daxter, Secret Agent Clank, Ape Escape on the Loose, Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, Persona 3 Portable, Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lion, Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together, Monster Hunter Freedom, Crisis Core Final Fantasy 7, Liberty City Stories and Vice City Stories, God of War Chains of Olympus and Ghosts of Sparta, Resistance Retribution, and Untold Legends. I had each and every one of those games, except for Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, which I got on Vita. I had every one of those games and I played the shit out of them. My friends and I figured out how to hack Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories when we were in middle school. We like had cheat engines running so you could hack in anything you wanted, like planes or whatever the hell. It was so cool, again, being able to like go to my friend's house with this thing and we could all play the same games together. And it was my first foray into online gaming with Killzone Liberation. I have so many great memories of playing games on the PlayStation Portable, and my launch unit lasted me pretty much the entire generation. The only time I ever upgraded my PSP was when I got the PSP Go, which was a really cool, once again, ahead of its time concept. That T-Mobile Sidekick action where you could slide the screen up and the buttons were right there. I played that thing so much in Driver's Ed. The big downfall was, of course, that all the games were digital, so I had to rebuy a lot of the games I already owned. But you know, it was still a really cool concept back in the day. I actually traded something for it on Craigslist to get one, and I love that thing. I still have it. I got the crystal white one, and it has this really cool sort of crystally sort of finish on it that I think is awesome. Biggest downsides with the PSP, of course, is the screen would get so scratched because it was like the actual whole front panel of the PSP had the screen cover built in, in. So even if you were using a case or whatever, or the included wrist strap, the screen would get so scratched up without even like, you could breathe on it and would get scratched up. Also, it didn't have two joysticks. It had a little joystick nub on the left side. And then so when you would play first person shooters like Coded Arms or something like that, the face buttons would be unusable for anything because they would have to control the right camera. So it's like Sony didn't feel like they needed a right stick, and then every game just turned the face buttons into the right stick, so clearly they did. And I think that's a huge reason why tactics games took off so much on the PSP. Stuff like Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Ogre, Metal Gear Acid 2. I think Jeanne d'Arc was one of the games that Sony put out on the PSP. They really made sense for what that hardware was. And then the biggest game on the PSP for sure was Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. I mentioned this in my review of Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I played that series completely out of order. I started with Crisis Core, I watched Advent Children, and yeah, the PSP ended up selling really well. The biggest downfall though was how easily hackable it was. At first you had to cut open the battery, which was really tough. My friend Sean and I did it. We used an X-Acto knife, but if the X-Acto knife touched any metal on the battery would expand and become unusable. So you had to be really careful to only cut the plastic, and then once you took the plastic off, you'd flip a little switch on the battery's motherboard, and then from that point you could install custom firmware onto the PSP and emulate games. You could play pirated games. So when I didn't have any money, I'm just gonna be honest, I pirated a lot of PSP games, and that's when Sony just completely killed the thing, because people were still buying the hardware, but they were buying it to hack the hardware to get free games. And as we all know, at that time Sony was selling these things for a loss, so they were really losing money on every PSP they sold, and they weren't making it back on games, so that became a huge problem. So they eventually killed off the PSP. But out of the whole pantheon of Sony hardware, I think the PSP really was one of the greatest handhelds of all time, and those games still hold up today. You can go get Resistance Retribution for free right now if you're subscribed to PlayStation Plus Essential. Check that game out. It's one of Ben Studio's greatest, I think, at least. And now we're on the last three consoles. I guess this one might be controversial, I don't know. Next up on my list is the PlayStation 2. I understand the monumental console that this was. It's still the best-selling console of all time. I think it actually just like 2 days ago hit 186 million consoles sold. So like, yeah, people really wanted that thing. Of course, aided by the fact that it became the de facto DVD player for a lot of people at the time. Of course, Sony couldn't recapture that with the PS3 and Blu-ray, but it really worked back in the day, being able to just play DVDs off of your PlayStation 2. It came out right around Halloween, October 26th, 2000, at a price of $300. I had the Xbox. My dad got me the Xbox. I didn't get a PS2 until much later when my friend upgraded to the PS3, but the library of games on PS2 was absolutely incredible, and I think that's the console that most people kind of came onto the PlayStation bandwagon with. It's where huge franchises like Silent Hill, Ratchet and Clank, Sly Cooper, Metal Gear Solid, and a million others really got their start. Gran Turismo 4 is apparently the best in the entire series. And out of all of Sony's consoles, I think the slimline revision of the PlayStation 2 is the best they've ever done. It's insane when you compare the size of the original PS2 to the size of the PS2 Slim. It's like, how did they even pack all of that hardware into something that small? And I guess if you look at the PS2 Slim, it's easy to see why they decided to put the PS2 in the PS3, because they were able to shrink down the tech so much. I also think the PS2 is where PlayStation really found its brand identity. That rainbow text that they had for the PS2 logo was everywhere at the time. They had great ads on TV. I used to love watching that SOCOM ad that would play right around Christmas, where people would use their headset to command their troops in games. Sony was getting weird and wild with all the different stuff they were putting out. There were games coming out left and right for that thing, and everyone you knew at the time had a PS2, so it was just a really good time to be a PlayStation fan. Again, I came on the bandwagon a little bit late, but again, it was still really cool once I eventually got it. All right, we got two left, guys, the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5, and the second place goes to the PlayStation 5. And I know it's weird to say that the newest console isn't the best of the bunch, but it really needs to come into its own, I think, in the same way the PlayStation 3 did. This one obviously came out in November of 2020. It was $400 or $500, whether you wanted the disc drive or not. The launch lineup, I would say, is decent with games like Demon's Souls and Spider-Man Miles Morales, but definitely like it was the smallest launch lineup I think I've experienced in my entire life, and nothing really hit with me at the time. The biggest reason I think I'm ranking this console at second place is because the vast majority of the games that really make the PS5 worth owning are also available on PlayStation 4, and you know, they still run and look really good on the PlayStation 4. And there's a million reasons why that is. The first and biggest one being that no one could get a PlayStation PlayStation 5 for the longest time. So not only were first-party developers that Sony had kind of hesitant to start porting games specifically to the PlayStation 5, but third-party devs went well into 2023 with porting games back to the PlayStation 4 that they were originally making for next gen. But when you have a console like the PlayStation 5, which hardware-wise is definitely bar none the best console Sony's ever made. I mean, like, using the interface is great, having all the online features is awesome, PlayStation Plus is great. I don't like the pricing structure of PlayStation Plus, but the fact that they have the extra library that gives people who don't have a ton of money to go spend $70 on games all the time a good opportunity to go back and play hundreds and hundreds of games. And there's also first party stuff on there. The DualSense controller is absolutely phenomenal. It really does make a lot of these games that were cross-generational feel next gen when you play them on the PlayStation 5. And my launch unit disk drive model still runs exactly the same as the day I got it. It's quiet, you can never hear it running. It's just great hardware all around. But again, when you've got games that are on PlayStation 4 coming out 3, almost 4 years into this thing's life cycle, that really shows that it either came out too early or the strategy from Sony just wasn't up to par with what it should have been. When Sony has a great generation like they did with the PlayStation 4, they get less consumer friendly and a lot more cocky, and that's where you get blunders like the PS3 being $600 and the PS5 not having PS5 games for the first few years of its existence. We're also at a point with the PS5 where there's not a lot of new IP coming out. Like, a lot of the best games on the PlayStation 4 were new IP at the time, and then they were sequelized to death. And now we're at the point with the PlayStation 5 where the best games are just getting remade over and over again. Games are getting director's cuts. They just need to get into this back half of the generation where we're going to hear about all of these first party games that are genuinely new. And then when I remake this video in like 3 or 4 years, I think the PS5 has more than enough opportunity and potential to overtake the PlayStation 4. But yeah, second place easily goes to the PlayStation 5. Right now, at this point in time, as much as I love it, I think it just needs time to come into its own and show us why it is the best PlayStation console outside of hardware. But that brings us to the number one greatest PlayStation console of all time, the PlayStation 4. I talked about my history with the PlayStation 3, how it really got me into the fandom for life with all those great games that I was talking about, like Uncharted and The Last of Us. And the PS4 just took everything great that the PS3 ended up being, ratcheted it up to 11, and made it just the best hardcore gaming console of all time. It came out November 15th, 2013 for a price of $399, and this thing was just ready to hit the ground running. We got that video, which was awesome, with Adam Boyes and Shuhei Yoshida showing how to share games on the PlayStation 4 because Xbox up so massively and was going to try to tie licenses to disc-based games, and Sony was like, nah, you can just share your games exactly how you did in the past, which was such a huge 1-2 punch against Xbox when Xbox really couldn't afford to have that. The price was awesome at $399 for what you were getting. And I mean, how many notable games can I list here? I've got about 10 or 15 that I'll just rattle through, starting with Final Fantasy 15, Control, The Last of Us Part 2, Uncharted 4, RE2 Remake, RE3 Remake, Red Dead Redemption 2, Killzone Shadowfall, Monster Hunter World, Horizon Zero Dawn, Death Stranding, Days Gone, Metal Gear Solid 5, Persona 5 Royal, Spider-Man, Final Fantasy 7 Remake, God of War 2018, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, The Witcher 3, Ghost of Tsushima, and Devil May Cry. And I'm not even scratching the surface with great games on the PlayStation 4. And it was the first time where, controversially, we got a mid-gen refresh with the PlayStation 4 Pro, but that console was great for me because it took everything I loved about the PS4 and just made it better, like the PS4 did with the PS3. Of course, the end of the PS4 generations, right when I started spinning up this channel, PSReady, which was also a huge life moment. I spent pretty much the entire PS4 generation, getting out of college. I moved out to LA, and then right after the PS5 launch, I moved back here to Michigan. So pretty much the best time of my life, my 20s, were spent with the PlayStation 4 generation, and all that, plus the amazing games, plus PlayStation Plus finally becoming a usable online network service, plus the ability to watch Blu-ray movies, plus the PS4 Pro, plus the great controller. Just everything about the PS4 was as close to perfect as I think a console could get, and that is why I am ranking it number one as the greatest PlayStation console of all time. But yeah, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. A little bit different than the news content here that I usually do. Let me know your ranking and what you thought of the video down in the comments below. And remember to subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.